Good afternoon. My name is Bill Iliopoulos. On behalf of Steve Nichols, myself, the Rutan Tucker Construction Group, I'd like to welcome you all to Rutan Tucker's 2012 Design Build Symposium. We've got a particularly distinguished panel this year, and we're going to be introducing them in just a few minutes. But first, I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then Steve Nichols is going to talk about some of the basics of this year's subject matter, which is public-private partnerships, bridging the infrastructure gap in California. You know, it used to be that design build itself was considered a cutting-edge idea and model in the construction industry. In fact, just a few years ago, it seemed like that was the case. The construction industry has blown right by that. I mean, things are happening so quickly now, since the advent of the internet, that it's not good enough for contractors or lawyers to simply be monitoring the cutting edge or aware of the cutting edge in your industry. You have to be on the cutting edge. You have to be making the cutting edge and developing it. And all of our panelists here are on that cutting edge, and so we're thrilled to have them here. The California Transportation Commission in 2011 projected the next 10 years infrastructure needs just for transportation, highways, roads, bridges, and rail systems. In California alone, for the next 10 years, we're facing a $300 billion, that's with a B, dollar deficit that we have to make up. So California's public officials and the private sector are really being forced to invent and create new delivery models for our infrastructure creation and maintenance in this state. There was a gentleman, a physicist, who won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1929, and at that time, the advent or the beginning of the Great Depression, he looked around the room and he said, "Gentlemen," you know, if he were doing it today, hopefully he'd say, "Ladies and gentlemen," but he said, "Gentlemen, we've run out of money. Now it's time to start thinking." It turns out that in California, our public officials are starting to think about ways that they can bridge this infrastructure gap, and our panelists today have been thinking about it for some time. P3 actually got its start in terms of elements of what we see today as public-private partnerships with in the United States with the 1869 Transcontinental Railroad. The United States partnered with Central Pacific Railroad. The United States gave Central Pacific Railroad land grants to give it an incentive to help build the railway system out from, I think it was Nebraska, out to California, because in California, as we all know, a few years before that, they had discovered gold, and a lot of people were moving out to California, and they needed a way to surface them and also get them out there. So the United States got in the P3 business, but since then, it's really been very scattered and few and far between in terms of P3 projects. Let me just talk for a minute about some of the basics of P3. What is P3 in terms of some of the elements? We look at our slides. P3 construction projects come in all shapes and sizes. There's not one particular type that defines it, but there are some elements that are typical of most P3 projects. Typically, P3 projects are built on public land and involve the transfer or contracting for design, build, finance, and long-term operation and maintenance, all provided by a private concessionaire. Oftentimes you'll hear the private concessionaire referred to as, different things, but it's basically a developer, okay? And the concessionaire is oftentimes an LLC or sometimes a partnership involving sometimes not only the developer, but certain financing arms, equity, or a design-build contractor, and sometimes even this long-term operations and maintenance service provider. Typically, P3 projects involve assets or improvements that you're building that have a projected revenue stream in the future. Things like toll roads or rail systems, or sometimes publicly owned healthcare facilities where they're charging money. We'll see some discussion, and in fact, you have an article that we've given you. There's a discussion in there in a little more detail about UC, University of California, using P3 to design, build, operate, and maintain UC student housing. Again, you've got that revenue stream in the future. Once you build the housing, the dormitory, you've got money coming in terms of student rent. P3 can be a very good solution, but for certain types of projects. It's not for all public works projects by any means. Again, typically, you've got a projected revenue stream, although we're going to hear today from Clark Construction, Frank Balls and Jim McClure, about, sorry about that, McClam, about
I knew I should have kept my name tag.
Yeah, I looked for it. We're going to hear from them about a P3 project that they're in the middle of that doesn't really have a projected revenue stream. So it's not only restricted to projects with projected revenue streams. So a few of the differences between projects. P3 projects have a different type of financing. You typically have the private sector, the private concessionaire, providing private financing. Now, sometimes it's a hybrid, public and private financing, or sometimes you have private financing and you have certain programs that by the public that help secure, or they might loan the private side some of the financing. But typically, there's at least some or all private financing involved. This allows public agencies to spread their financing for projects over longer project terms and leverage their infrastructure construction budgets, which of course is very important in today's time and given today's economy. The other area that really is a landmark of P3s and is different from traditional is with design build, we saw a transfer of the design risk and even more of a transfer of the construction risk. In that regard, in terms of transferring risks and efficiencies to the private sector, P3 is like design build on steroids. Because P3, the object of P3 from the public entity's standpoint, I think, is to really transfer a lot of that responsibility and risk to the private concessionaire. And the idea is that for certain types of projects, the private sector can handle it more efficiently and price it accordingly than the public sector can. So you have here on the slide design risk transfer. Typically, the design for a P3 project is performance-based design where the owner's simply giving maybe a conceptual design to something sufficient to be able to compare proposals, but certainly nothing like a prescriptive design where the owner is delegating the design itself. That's a design risk that's being transferred to the concessionaire. The payment risk transfer. Availability payments simply means that, and which is a typical but not sole or exclusive P3 payment scheme. Availability payments means that for most of the payments, not all the payments, but most of the payments under a P3 delivery model, the big payments will be to the concessionaire from the public owner will be once the facility or improvement becomes at least substantially complete or complete, so it's available for the owner's use, and that revenue stream can then start kicking in and help the owner pay for it. Obviously, this is a big benefit to the owner in a lot of cases. There's also another model called the toll revenue payment model, where if it's a toll road or some other revenue basis, once the revenue comes in, instead of that revenue going to the owner, and the owner in turn paying the concessionaire at the point of completion of the project, and this other type of model, the tolls or revenue go directly to the concessionaire to pay off its financing for the job. Even where we have availability payments or toll revenue payments, generally there are other milestone payments that occur before that, and of course after the project's been made available, because typically when you're talking about, for example, the after portion, the subsequent to completion portion, these jobs involve the concessionaire operating and maintaining the project for 20 to 40 years. This is a long-term commitment and with a long-term payment stream. Construction risk transfer, that of course is always a pushing point between the owner and the developer. But here the idea is for certain construction risks that under a typical design bid build project or even a design build project, you would want to be, if you're the owner, you want to transfer the contractor. But oftentimes in those projects, the traditional projects, the contractor pushes back. Things like if you're talking about transportation, different types of permits, obtaining right-of-ways from other public agencies. On a P3 project, generally the concessionaire has pushed onto it even more responsibility than under design build or traditional delivery methods than for P3. So the construction risk transfer, again, it's a little bit like design build on steroids, pushing even more so. So we're seeing an evolution, it seems like, we're in the middle, to me, of an evolution. Owners, especially certain agencies, are realizing that the way they're doing this is not the most efficient way in terms of letting public works projects, and there's less money for right now. So they want to push the monetary flow out over 20 to 30 years and let the private sector deal with responsibility and along with it the risks. Finally, operations and maintenance risk transfer is a very important part. We talk about life cycle risk transfers for the whole life cycle of the asset, 20 or 30, 40 years out. And there's a strong sentiment, I think, among public owners that can be more efficiently transferred to the private sector than the public sector. Now, I want to turn it over to Steve Nichols, who's our co-chair of our construction group, and he's going to talk about the need for P3 in California and also P3's enabling legislation in California, because you need statutes that allow you to do P3 in order to do it. Otherwise, the default in California is the traditional design, bid, build model where the job goes to the lowest bidder. And then Steve is going to also introduce our panel. We're keeping you in suspense. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let me start by introducing the full panel here so we all know who everyone is. First of all, we have Kome Ajise. Kome, if you would stand. Kome is the project manager. He's with Caltrans, project manager for public-private partnerships. He's the acting deputy director of the planning and modal program. Kome began his career with Caltrans in 1987 in District 6, which is in Fresno. In 2000, Comey was appointed the first office chief for the Caltrans Headquarters Office of Community Planning in Sacramento. That office became the focal point for Caltrans' smart growth initiatives. Comey also served in the North Region Environmental Division, and he was the chief of that division until April of 2004, when he was appointed as the District 10 Director in Stockton, California. We're very pleased to have Comey with us here today. Thank you, Comey.
Thank you.
You can applaud. Anything to wake us up. Next, we have Frank Baltz. Frank is the Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Officer with Clark Construction Group, LLC. Frank is responsible, of course, for the company's legal matters. In 2010, Frank led the Clark team in closing the nation's first social performance-based infrastructure PPP project, which is the courthouse for the California Administrative Office of the Courts in Long Beach, which will be one of our case studies here today. Frank also has worked on PPP projects with the University of California at San Francisco for the development of the neuroscience laboratory there. Thank you, Frank. We're very happy to have Frank here, of course, too. Next, we have Sam Gilmore of Kiewit. Sam is the Deputy General Counsel, Vice President and General Counsel for Kiewit Corporation and Kiewit Development Company. Sam has the overall legal responsibility for Kiewit's alternative and financed projects and that's including design-build public-private partnerships, design-build finance projects, as well as the company's strategic planning for those projects. Sam has worked on virtually all of Kiewit's P3 projects and has experience in all aspects of Kiewit's design-build programs. Thanks for being here as well, Sam.
Thank you.
Then we have the distinguished Mark Kempton with us today. Mark is the project director with Skanska Infrastructure Development for North America. Mark is responsible for the development of public-private partnerships in the western United States and Canada for Skanska. Mark identifies and assesses public projects for private partnership potential. Try saying that 3 times fast. And then leads those projects through to commercial and financial close. Mark has spent 18 years managing private procurement projects, coordinating corporate responses to public policy, and leading several strategic initiatives related to federal, state, and local government requirements. Happy to have Mark with us today, too. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much.
And last but not least, we have Jim McLean.
Cynthia, give me my card back. I want my name tag. That was
Jim McClam. Jim is the Senior Vice President with Clark Construction Group, LLC. Jim's responsible for managing and has overall responsibility for day-to-day operations of Clark's Los Angeles and Southern California region. In that capacity, Jim oversees project operations and administration. He has 27 years in the construction industry and has built a diverse portfolio with a range of different projects in different market sectors, including sports, healthcare facilities, civic, education, entertainment. He's a strong proponent of collaborative delivery methods such as IPD and design-build. Most recently, of course, Jim spearheaded Clark's public-private partnership endeavors in the western region, resulting in the successful acquisition of the new $350 million Long Beach court building project. Again, the project we're going to be talking about today. So thanks, Jim, for being here as well. Okay, Bill asked me to discuss a little bit the need for public-private partnerships in California, and then also to address the statutory framework for them in California. So that's what I'm going to do. The first slide that we have here kind of reports on the California Transportation Commission Needs Assessment Report, which was in November of last year. And it provides a 10-year anticipated needs assessment. Basically, the findings are these. The total costs for system preservation and management and expansion during that 10-year study period is about $538 billion. The total estimated revenue for that same period is about $242 billion. And so we can do the math and figure out that there's a funding shortfall of about $296 billion. And that, of course, is for transportation in California. This is the slide that basically shows those numbers, and you can see on the far left, if I can get the pointer over there and hold it steady, some of the different kinds of projects that or a different sort of infrastructure need, I should say, that is addressed in this report. You can see the $538 billion that is totaled there, and the revenue source below. So obviously a shortfall that's appreciable. The American Society of Civil Engineers did a report as well, which is pretty much to the same effect in 2012. Their report addresses a slightly broader scope of different kinds of infrastructure need, but they comment on the fact that California's massive growth is continuing, expected to be 54 million by the year 2040. And they estimate needs, this is on a per year basis. You can see streets, highways, bridges at $46.5 billion per year across 10 years. Flood control and drainage, et cetera. If you total all those up, sorry I don't have it on the slide for you, but it comes out to about $750 billion across 10 years. So the need obviously is there. There's a need for infrastructure in this state, infrastructure improvement in this state, and there is obviously a funding shortfall for that. California has responded to some extent with several pieces of legislation. The first one I'm going to touch on real quickly, and I'll try and go through these quickly because this material is fascinating. But the first one is the Streets and Highways Code, Section 143, which deals with state transportation projects. And effectively what it does is it authorizes the regional transportation agencies and Caltrans to enter comprehensive development lease agreements with public or private entities for transportation projects. Allows contracting entity to collect the tolls and user fees on the completed facilities. And it has a list of general requirements. We won't touch on all of them, but it does require approval by the California Transportation Commission and the Public Infrastructure Advisory Commission and the legislature with some level of public comment for the project to be approved. It must be owned by the agency, and the project must revert to the agency at the end of the lease period. Of course, Caltrans is responsible for the specs and for the inspections and the like. It can be awarded based on the lowest bid or the best value. And there are qualification requirements which come into play. Increases in tolls and user fees, of course, are carefully regulated and controlled. And perhaps the most controversial or potentially problematic point is that this sunsets out December 31, 2016. So although it's unlimited number of projects to that point, at that time, it sunsets out unless the legislature acts to extend it. But that's the state legislation for transportation projects. California also has Section 5956 of the Government Code, and this is for local agencies, and it authorizes those agencies to enter into agreements with private entities to use private investment capital. And that's the emphasis point here, private investment capital for the purpose of designing, building, developing, and financing fee-producing infrastructure projects. It's a very broad statute in terms of the number of different kinds of projects that are authorized for this program. And you can see the list there. It includes irrigation and drainage, energy and power production plants, all kinds of water supply treatment and distribution plants, flood control, harbors, municipal improvements is the way the statute is worded, commuter and light rail, certain kinds of highways and bridges, airports and runways, water purification, sewage treatment, refuse. Again, very broad, many different kinds of projects are covered. General requirements, and we'll just touch on those quickly. First of all, it's private financing, that is the emphasis. There's to be no government financing for these programs. Federal and local funding are permitted. It doesn't seem to permit state funding. There's no reference to a permission for state funding. You can't have state projects. You can't have state highway toll roads you can't have state financing. The lease term may not exceed 35 years. And of course, it has to revert to the agency at the end. There are strict rules here as well for user fee increases. Competitive negotiation is the way these contracts are to be formed. No competitive bidding is allowed under the statute. There must be demonstrated competence for the concessionaire. Only private sector financing, no public debt financing is permitted. And of course, payment and performance bonds are required. And the permitting and authorization process can be part of the agreement and documentation. All right, so this is an interesting statute. It's a broad statute. It's one that I think has not received a lot of, there haven't been a lot of projects in California that have invoked this statute, and so, but it does not have a sunset period. Okay, next we have Government Code Section 70371.5A and 70391B. This is for court facilities. This statute authorizes leases and service contracts with private sector participants for the purpose of sharing risks of financing, construction, and operation of court facilities. And it establishes a new critical needs account for the state, for state court facilities, authorizes our state judicial council in California to control that account. And the judicial council is supposed to determine which projects, make recommendations for projects for the State Public Works Board. The recommendation can be based on a number of factors, including economic opportunity, which itself includes financial partnerships with private parties and fund contributions from private parties that result in lower project delivery cost. Now, there's a solicited project, again, I've referenced it a couple of times now, that Clark Construction is going to be talking about, Jim and Frank, as we get farther along here, but that's one important state court facility project that we have. All right, finally, the last one I wanted to touch on. This is Public Utilities Code Section 185036 for high-speed rail, a very general statute that effectively says not very much. It authorizes the high-speed rail authority to enter contracts with public or private entities for these projects, and of course to acquire the rights of way for them, and to issue debt. However, the authority is conditioned on the further statute or voter approval of a financial plan. And we had such approval in November of 2008 when the voters approved the Bond Act for just under $10 billion. The Attorney General's office issued an opinion in 2009 confirming that that meets the requirements of this statute. And so they are authorized to proceed with high-speed rail in California as a result. All right, again, I hope I didn't put too many people to sleep with that little discussion. At this point, what I'll do is turn it back over to Bill, and we can proceed to our panel.
Thanks, Steve. So we thought one of the best ways to describe the latest developments in California in terms of P3 would be to go through some case studies. And since these gentlemen are all involved in some of the biggest and most recent P3 projects, not only in California, but frankly, nationwide, we're going to have them describe for you, and they've got some slides also, one by one, 3 case studies. The first case study will be the Presidio Parkway project, otherwise known as Doyle Drive in San Francisco, the on-ramp to the Golden Gate Bridge. And the second will be a discussion about that judiciary, the Long Beach Courthouse P3 project in Long Beach. And then finally, a discussion about, there really aren't any, or very few healthcare facilities. One that I know of in California that we've discussed in the article about P3 projects for healthcare. But Mark Kempton is going to talk about Skanska's project, the new Karolinska, did I get that right?
Yes.
Hospital project in Sweden, which is, I believe, the largest,
The world's largest P3.
healthcare facility that's P3, or world's largest period.
Just healthcare.
Okay. All right. So without further ado, Sam or Kome, who's going first?
I'll go. I'll start, I think. You didn't give me an instruction manual for this thing. All right, we had that one. So there's an overview of the Presidio Parkway project. I think Kome will have to tell us why it went from the Doyle Drive project to the Presidio Parkway project. And I have all my files say Doyle Drive, and then I get things that say Presidio Parkway. I never know where to put anything anymore. It's somewhere in the middle of the transaction, they changed the name to Presidio, which only confused me. I think everybody else was fine with it. But it's an interesting project. There aren't a lot of projects in California yet, even though they've had the legislation. I think Steve talked quite a bit about the opportunity in California, but there hasn't been a lot of people or projects that have taken off just yet. But it sounds like maybe there should be a little bit more on the horizon. So the Doyle Drive project was one of the first projects that came out, certainly the first road project, and it's probably a project that lends itself to sort of a quick, easy transition. At least we thought going in, because it was going to be a pretty simple project. A lot of the design was done. The teams were kind of given a set of project documents that were pretty clear. We ran into a few problems along the way with the government employees union, or engineers union. But the project closed and it's taken off, and it's started out now. We're in the demolition stage, I think, on some of the properties, and we're going through the design. What I wanted to talk about a little bit, though, was, is there a laser on here? Is it that red button? Yeah. Was the team that's chasing after the project, and then kind of how everybody fits together in these deals. And we talk about P3 projects, we talk about kind of developers and concessionaires and who everybody is. I thought it might be helpful to sort of show everybody how they fit into the equation. So when the deal first came out, Caltrans put the project on the street. Excuse me, several people chased after the project under the development role. The developers on the project were Hochtief and Meridian. So they come and they form a consortium with the contractor, which was Flatiron and Kiewit, and then Kiewit and Flatiron hired the designer, and then Hochtief and Meridian also brought on Transfield to do the operations. So this isn't just a construction project. This is a deal that involves building the project and then operating and maintaining it for some period of time, and also financing the project. All of that stuff goes into the equation, and sometimes we look at it as just a road project, but it's so much more. The other thing I'd like to point out is this concessionaire is formed at financial close. They are what we call a special purpose entity. They have basically no assets. They're a conduit for the contract and the funding. They don't have really any history. They're just formed for the single purpose of building a project. So from the contractor standpoint, they need to know that the money is coming down from the DOT through the availability payments. They need to understand where the financing is coming from, because it's not coming from the concessionaire. As I said, they're just a conduit. So for the contractors in the audience, it's important to recognize that although you're not in contract with the department and you're not really responsible for the financing of the project, you have to be aware of what the financing is in order to understand where your payments are going to be coming from.
Hey, Sam, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is it who's on the concessionaire / contractor side of the equation? Who started the interest? Who? I
mean, is it the chicken and the egg, which came first?
Well, yeah. And what is typical in your experience? Does the developer get interested? Are they out there looking for these things? Do they usually get interested first and line up the design builder, the other way around, or can it go all different ways?
There is a finite number of contractors who are able to be in the box for P3 projects. There's huge security requirements. They have a lot of for U.S. projects, a lot of bonding in addition to the letters of credit that have to be provided. So there aren't a lot of contractors that are available to do that work. So what you find is that those contractors kind of are in the catbird seat, and they're able to interview some of the developers, and they form teams. And when the project gets on the street, everybody makes kind of a mad dash. Who we're going to team with? Who's the right guy to do the project? Who's going to pass the qualification requirements? All of it's a big kind of consideration that everybody goes through. But the way we did this project is we talked to Flatiron first, and we decided who was going to take the lead, and then we interviewed developers.
You know, interesting, Bill, on that note, when we did Long Beach, we made a team with AECom, our architect, and then we interviewed developers, and just very much like what you just described. Matter of fact, we had one Babcock and Brown for half a year.
Yeah, until they weren't in Babcock and Brown anymore.
Until they weren't in that business anymore. We got another one. We ended up with Meridian as well.
Yeah, and so a lot of these guys, Meridian, Hochtief is a German company. Meridian is French, and they bring a lot of the equity to the deal. They don't. I mean, they'll arrange the equity. Sometimes it comes from a fund. Meridian has a fund that they provide the equity. Then they'll go out and find all the financing, be it bonds or banks, and sort of all that gets arranged. And then when you get to financial close, which is kind of the effective date of the contract, everything goes into the concession box, and the SPE runs it from there on.
And Sam, of the entities up there, how many are U.S. based and how many are foreign entities that are in this market?
Well, Flatiron used to be U.S. based, but they are owned. Flatiron came with Hochtief because Hochtief purchased Flatiron from Royal BAM, I think, and now ACS has purchased Hochtief, and so they own Hochtief and Flatiron as well. Meridian is French, like we said. Transfield, Australian. Yeah, I think that's right. They are Australian. And then Kiewit's really the only U.S. Well, HNTB and Caltrans. Everybody else is
which
about
just
half,
gives you an indication of how much of this triple P market is coming from outside the United States to do work in this country.
Right. Yeah, so that's a fairly typical map of the way things work. And like I said, just one more time, that concessionaire, that is sort of the linchpin to the whole thing. And then when you look at it, it's really just the four corners of the contract. I wanted, just this slide real quick, I just wanted to show that a lot of people say, who owns the project? And there'll be a lot of misinformation about the public is selling the project, they're giving up their rights to the asset, to the road, to the hospital, to whatever. That's not true. They're only assigning an interest in either a revenue stream, if it's tolling, if it's an availability payment, it'll be a right to manage the project and collect a fee over a period of time. But the owner, the original owner, always owns the project. The things that are different are that the private sector will take responsibility for design, building, and the operations and maintenance of the project. That's probably the big difference, and that's why these projects have a 30 or 35, 50-year term. Somebody's delivered the asset, they've built the project, but then it has to be maintained for that period of time, and so that operations component is something that's quite different. On this slide, really the only thing I just wanted to point out is that the SPF is the contracting entity with Caltrans for the life of the project, and that's similar to just what we talked about in the slide. And then, being a lawyer, I just like this slide because there's gobs of agreements with this thing. There are so many agreements.
Somehow I'm going to guess there were actually more agreements.
Oh, there's tons more. These are just the key agreements. There are. I mean, the thing about these projects is they're not exactly construction projects. They're deals, and when you have deals, that means you have bankers and lawyers involved, and that just means complexity.
More agreements.
There'll be complexity. So there's just a lot of agreements. Lawyers play a huge role in P3 projects.
Is it a constructive role?
Well, Frank, what do you think?
No comment.
I'll give this to Comey now.
Thank you. We started the project actually started talking about the project in 2009. Authorization became effective May of 2009. And so we started looking around for projects that fit the 143 model. And we had a number of projects that we were looking at, but essentially we boiled down to Doyle Drive because it was the one project of all the large projects we had that was actually past environmental approval. And most people wonder why we ended up with Doyle Drive. That was really the one reason. Most of the other projects that were interesting, would have been nice to do, were not yet through environmental approval. So you really can't prosecute them, and we still don't have any, even until today. And so we started working on Doyle Drive, putting it together as a P3 package, and went to the commission in 2010 as required by the law, and got commission approval after 2 tries in May of 2010, and proceeded immediately. We got approval on the 25th of May. We had our draft RFP on the streets on 26th of May, and really moved very fast through procurement. It was a very tight procurement time frame. And I say I'll never do it again, but it was so much fun. I think I might do it again. And we went through procurement and ended up with a preferred proposer by the middle of October. October 15th, we were able to select our proposer. And so that was, I think, really about 12 weeks of real work and evaluation, and ended up with a proposer. Shortly after we named our proposer, we had a lawsuit filed just the day after election, I believe. The lawsuit was filed. And we proceeded, even though we had an injunction, to not sign the law. The law requires, after you have a deal, that you wait 60 days before you execute it. And the 60 days was for the legislature to review it, for public review. And we had a public meeting actually on the 20th of October, after we had enough time to negotiate with the concessionaire, and we had a deal. We took that to the public on the 20th of October. And so the 60-day clock began about then, to end shortly, I think just before or after Christmas, I forget now. So we had a package that was ready to sign. We had a commercial package that was ready for execution. We were fortunate that the trial court found in our favor, and so our injunction to sign was released, and so we signed that deal the day, the very first business day after we got the injunction released. So we signed on the 3rd of January, and then court finally ruled on the main case in February, and we proceeded at that point to begin our financial close process, and then issued our notice to proceed one to begin design work in April. With court, of course, the appeal was filed, and the appeal ruling came in August. It was a very expedited appeal process. We asked for it, and the court granted us a very expedited review and appeal, and subsequently we had a Supreme Court overrule. I mean, it was not a secret challenge. It was the Engineers Public Employees Union that challenged the project under 143 as ineligible for 143. So it challenged the basis of the project as a P3, essentially. So once we got the Supreme Court denial of their review, we were free basically to restart our financial process, and eventually got our financial deal closed in June of this year. Just a quick summary of, I think Bill talked about payment mechanisms. On this deal, we have two basic payment mechanisms. There's a milestone payment and there's an availability payment. The milestone payment is paid at substantial completion. We have a $185 million milestone payment. Because of rules at the federal government level, we have a TIFIA loan on the deal that the concessionaire opted for at a very good rate. TIFIA, the federal government, and it's kind of complicated to get into, but we cannot repay the federal government, even though we're not in direct contract with the federal government, it's the concessionaire. The monies that we pay through the concessionaire to pay the TIFIA loan has to be non-federal. And for all of the public funds we have on the project, we only had about 191 million non-federal. And so the federal government crafted a loan with a short-term and long-term tranche, 2 tranches that would capture the totality of the non-federal monies available. So the short-term tranche was 91 million. And so that gets paid about the same time as the original milestone payment that we had put in the deal. So we, in essence, we have 2 milestone payments. One is the original one that we had in our proposal going through the deal, and the one that repays the short-term tranche for TIFIA. On the availability payment, it's over a 30-year period from substantial completion, and it's a quarterly payment structure. We instituted a debt competition process because typically in a P3 you want the developer to come in, the proposals to come in with set finance, and you want them to come in with their finance package. So you judge that. Where we were, because of the uncertainty of the lawsuit, we really could not expect anybody to have secured financing. And so we sort of had a hybrid where we allowed them to come in with a model financing, and they competed on that. And then we did a debt competition once we picked the preferred bidder. And through that process, arrived at a very favorable set of rates that I think we found to be attractive to us. We had going in a requirement by the CTC for an affordability limit of $35 million, which meant that our AP could not be over $35 million a year. The bid came in at $28 million. By the time we closed financing, the AP was at $21 million. So we felt like it really worked out well for us, and it was a credit to the state that our AP payments would be lower.
Komei, can I just interrupt you there for 1 second and throw a question out to the whole panel? You mentioned TIFIA. So TIFIA and Safety Lou are 2 related federal statutes that have been on the books for several years that provide, in which the federal government, through these statutes, is providing support through loan programs and other types of security arrangements to help states enable them to do these P3 projects. I am not aware, and I'm wondering if anybody else is, of any non-transportation, those are limited to transportation, any non-transportation areas of P3 that are supported by even state government type loan programs similar to TIFIA and Safety Lou. Are any of you?
I think there's some federal money available for rail projects.
Yeah,
But it's not TIFIA.
But it's not TIFIA. TIFIA is strictly
RIF money. Yeah.
That's right. RIF.
I have enough worries about transportation. I don't.
Yeah, I
look
think
elsewhere.
and that's one of the things.
Energy folks might have a program, but I couldn't tell you.
I think if in California, for example, we want to really push some of these other areas of infrastructure besides transportation and transit, rail, I think that's one of the things that's probably got to happen, because those have been a tremendous boost to P3s on transportation and rail jobs.
TIFIA is an integral part of probably closing most of the projects that are out there right now. There's just not enough money in the deal to get it done without TIFIA's support.
Right.
Yeah, TIFIA really helps you buy down your finance cost. Essentially, that's what it does, and it helped tremendously in our case.
And with the expansion of TIFIA now with MAP 21, we'll just be seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, when we went through TIFIA, the old rules, you could only qualify for no more than 1/3 the capital cost of the project, and I think now you can go up to 49% of the capital cost. Mm-hmm. And at the time we went, TIFIA only had about $1 billion of play. No, 133 million available in any budget year. And that 133 million could be stretched to about $1 billion in credits. So you could do about $1 billion worth of work with the 133. MAP 21, the new authorization, has $1 billion in it, which means you can do up to $10 billion in capacity under the new law. So TIFIA has really gone on steroids, as you said.
Let me ask you one other quick question to follow up something you said. You talked about the Transportation Commission approval, and that involved I'm sure the money for value analysis. Can you just explain what a money for value analysis is and what part it played in your project's approval?
Yeah, we took the extra step because it was our very first project. There were a lot of skeptics. We felt like it was important to do a due diligence analysis on how P3s would compare to, on this project, would compare to traditional delivery. So we did a value for money analysis that looked at, because what we don't tend to do is when we do a design bid build, the contractor builds it, and the day we buy the job, he's gone. And we own it now. We never track the life cycle from then on. And so we had to model a typical life cycle if we had gone traditional delivery and then did what the P3 model would do and try to compare both on a 30-year life cycle cost. And the key to that is deciding what discount rate you're going to use to net present value, both of those, to compare apples to apples. And so in our analysis, we're able to demonstrate that the P3 procurement process gave us about a 24% net present value advantage over traditional delivery. Of course, it was questioned, and we kind of fought through that all through the process. But we were very certain in our belief that if you had gone traditional delivery, given the data we had, there's a tendency to have cost overruns because of the friction between design and construction that you have in traditional delivery. We design it, you build it. There's always arguments about whether it's designed right or you're building it right. So that tends to add to cost over time. With a design build model in the P3, we don't care who designed it. It's all on the developer. And so you don't have that. So there's some savings there. And so the potential for cost overrun, there was a differential there that at least added to the lifecycle cost. And then, of course, the lifecycle cost itself. The P3 model has a very disciplined regime to make sure that you do what needs to be done, because at the end of the 30 years, there's a handback requirement. But we're not waiting until the 28th year to begin to wonder about the handback. In fact, the P3 concessionaire in our case is required to set up a renewal account that is funded. And of course, we follow the renewal program. That program is submitted to us for review. And so we are at least kept abreast of the lifecycle work they're doing. And then the renewal account turns into a handback account at year 26. And so it sort of tails up from there. So there's that strict discipline of making sure that you're ensuring life cycle that I think that our model was able to show in the business case review.
Probably one point on that, Comey, is that life cycle obligation is monitored very carefully throughout. And in order for the concessionaire to receive the payment, the availability payment, they have to be able to show that they've delivered the project, but also maintained it in a condition that's required under the contract, which is fairly stringent.
Yeah. Just quickly, the concessionaire needed about $362 million to do the project. In our design, in our original estimate, very early preliminary estimate, we had estimated that the project was this phase of the project was going to cost about $470 million. And so there was a bid savings just in the design build alone. So that came through. So it's evidence we have to show that that this process was a little bit more efficient. This is how the package was structured. Commercial loans, the short-term TFIA, long-term TFIA, and equity requirement was 12.5%. That was by contract. We felt like equity needed to have skin in the game for the long term. The short-term loans are paid off. The commercial bank loan and the short-term TFIA are paid off at substantial completion. And then the long-term TFIA and equity stays for the long haul. When we went to financing, partly because the market was just so favorable at the time we closed, we came in way under what the bid projections were on the financing, and that's what this slide tends to show. We were able to get the bank rate at about 2.5%, and the long-term TFIA rate was about 2.7%. The short-term TFIA rate, we got at about 0.46%. And so it was fun closing the deal.
If the private concessionaire down the road sometime is able to refinance at a lower interest rate, is there an issue? Is that taken care of in your agreement?
There's gain share in the contract. We get 85% of that gain share.
No pain share.
That's pain share.
Just gain share, though.
Well, I mean, if they refinance, that's a discretionary action. So hopefully they refinance and to make some for a gain.
Did the financing for this project match the term of the deal? So, or did the concessionaire take some risk by doing shorter term financing than the term of the lease?
No, actually, one of the real interesting and elegant element of the proposal that came from the GLC team was the financing. It was just so elegant in its simplicity. Basically, they structured it to have the short-term loan repaid off by the milestone payment. So they had sculpted it that way and expected TIFIA to be in the long term because it's lower interest rate. And so it basically matched it. It was TIFIA that could not get over the fact that we didn't quite show enough non-federal in our current appropriation, which we promised we will do over time. After all, we had 30 years, but they couldn't go forward unless it was saying that right this minute. And so they then structured their loan to match exactly what was in the appropriation.
Comey, I've got a question. When Sam was going over all the different contracts, you said, I hate that slide. You said, I like. What would you say is the most difficult point of negotiation or elements of the negotiation for this project?
Quite frankly, I think it was on the public side. It was trying to get all of our partners together and decide on how we're going to source the public money. I think that was more difficult in identifying which monies were going to go where and whose money was going to go where. I think that was more difficult than dealing directly with the private side. Now, when there was a little bit of a hardship having to go back to renegotiate the cost, because after all, we had waited a year because of litigation. Their bid was now expired by, I think August was the date, August of 2011, their bid expired. And so it would have been unfair for us to say, you're still gonna have to keep to those prices. So we got together very quickly and negotiated how we would address the cost increase. Now, with that negotiation, we came away with additional $21 million on top of the design build contract that was in the deal before. That was relatively easy. I mean, it wasn't easy, but compared to dealing with fund sources on the public side, it was a good partnership. We were able to come to terms very quickly once we knew what the interests were and what the objectives were.
I think that's a good point. I mean, it was a partnership because when the team bid the project, they were assuming that the close was going to occur within a certain period of time.
It was supposed to be March of 11.
Yeah, which is very fast. And when that didn't happen and then the bids expired and then some of the contracts expired, there was a willingness on all sides to try to figure out a way to solve the problem. And it was a problem, but it wasn't insurmountable as long as everybody was willing to kick in, and they were. So I think it was very good.
And quite frankly, I think it wasn't even just the contractors package that was the troublesome part. I think it was the subcontractors. How long were you going to string them on, and could you really have them hold on to their prices? So there was a cascading effect of that delay beyond just the principals in the deal, all the way down to the very smallest subcontractors.
But this is really a financing model, right? I mean, there's no really money coming back, a revenue stream. I mean, it's not going to be a toll road, right?
It's not a toll road, and
It's really just a financing model to keep where you get the money sooner than later through other means through the private sector.
well, you could have toll collection on this. In fact, there's language in our contract that you could have tolls collected. So you could have this in a toll road model as well. We chose to not have tolls collected here because it might not be too good for Golden Gate Bridge, for example. And Golden Gate Bridge, as a contribution to make sure that we didn't have tolls on this, chipped in $80 million. as part of our public financing package. So I don't know that you couldn't have the same model in a toll setting, where the tolls will come to the public side and you use the tolls to make the AP payments.
From your perspective, the public sector perspective on this project, was the most enticing part of it the fact that you could have the private sector come up with the financing, or was the most enticing aspect the risk transfer and kind of the efficiencies long term?
Without question, it was a risk transfer. You are building within the largest urban park in the country with a landlord that's very, very particular. We could not afford to have a laissez-faire type maintenance, and so this lent itself to performance-based maintenance and O&M over time. So that risk transfer was very important to us. The financing, I think, is really for us is probably nominal, but there is a lot to be said for how much public program funds we free up, because we didn't have to do the $400 million construction like today. So because we're not paying up that construction cost today, basically our shop funds that are in this project then can be used to build some other projects. And so there is an opportunity cost.
How big was when you did your value for money analysis, how big was the argument or discussion on the value you put on that risk that you no longer had that Sam took on at that point?
I'm not sure how I quantify that.
I'm not sure how we quantify it either.
It was, no, I mean, if we had built it, I mean, we built phase 1 and we were going to build phase 2 anyway. We would have had to slug through dealing with Presidio, Trust, and the Park Service and all of that. But I don't think we even realized at the time we were making this a P3 how much of a relief this was going to be, that we have somebody who actually will mind the store in this. Having Transfield be there and having their expertise from other properties they manage, I think it's something we're becoming aware of. It's a process that's unfolding before our eyes.
I think just to address the financing question, there's a common misconception that, especially here in the United States, that P3 is a financing mechanism. It has to be noted that we are not arranging loans for the owner, for the government, in this case the public sector. The private sector is taking on these loans. The SPV is taking on the loan. If something goes wrong, if there is a situation similar to, let's say, 125, SR 125, nominally, the government is not responsible. The loan, the default is on the private sector side. So the private sector is taking on financing risk as well. Sure. So that's really what this all comes down to. As Kome said, this is really all about risk transfer. It just so happens that in public-private partnerships, part of that risk transfer is finance risk transfer.
And one thing that we've heard from a number of agency clients and other municipalities around the country, in California as well, is that what they like about the triple P delivery method is it takes them out of their procurement codes and just makes, for all the paper you have to sign, as far as the agencies are concerned, it makes the delivery for the agency a lot easier to accomplish. They've transferred the risk. They know they're getting world-class partners who are very skilled at delivering the service that's needed.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move on to the Long Beach Courthouse.
Great.
And Frank and Jim.
You want to kick it off, Frank?
Okay. Next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the delivery of a what's known as social infrastructure project. And this is a rendering of what the new Long Beach Courthouse will look like in Long Beach. Has anyone here ever spent any time at the existing Long Beach Courthouse in Long Beach, California? Well, if you ever have the opportunity, it is a building that's probably 40 or more years old that looks every day of 100 years old. And one of the issues that was the hardest issue for the lenders to get, one of the most difficult issues for them to get around, in California was the idea that the deal is going to be subject to appropriation risk in terms of the availability payment. So they were very concerned with California, all the issues we read about in the newspaper on a regular basis. These were all Canadian and European banks. This was the toughest issue in the negotiations until the day the AOC took them to the existing courthouse. Once they saw the conditions of the Long Beach courthouse, they knew the state would have no choice but to make the payments. The state might default on many other obligations long before they would default on this courthouse. And that's one reason why the AOC chose the Long Beach courthouse to be their first performance-based infrastructure project, was because it was the court that was in the greatest need of rebuilding.
You know, just a side note, and all the time we spent in New York, and Frank's going to walk you through the number of banks. They told us if this were built in any other state in this country, it would have shaved about 6 months off of getting the financing in place, just because of the state regulations and what California is as a risk to the banks that we have in our consortium.
Now, this is the structure that was used for the Long Beach project. To take you through that a little bit, at the top you have the agency, which is the Judicial Council of California, the administrative office of the courts. And truly, one thing that's needed is you need someone who wants these projects on the government side. COME, in the case of Caltrans, was the champion. In our case, it was the administrative office of the courts. They wanted this deal to happen. And also, actually, as big a proponent was Governor Schwarzenegger. He made a commitment to some people that this project would happen before he left office. If you look to the left, you'll see the equity was Meridiam, who also was involved in Doyle Drive, Paris-based. They made an equity contribution to the special purpose entity, Long Beach Judicial Partners. And then there were 6 commercial banks. At one point, bonds were considered for the project, but Meridiam opted for short-term financing on this project. So you have a long-term lease with short-term financing. So here we know there will be a refinancing. If there's a loss on the refinancing, it's absorbed entirely by the sponsor. If there is a gain on the refinancing, a portion of it is to the benefit of the state. And then under the project company, you have the design builder. Clark was the builder, and AECOM the designer. And then you have the facilities maintenance and capital improvements contract, which was Johnson Controls. And on the facility side, as you might imagine, if you looked at the existing courthouse, you'd say somewhere along the line, someone did not contribute the capital necessary to keep that building up. So it looks as good as a building you might see if you were in a Gerald Hines or Boston Properties or some other developer who has a building for 40 years, and 40 years later, it's a very well-kept building. Not necessarily the case with some public buildings, and that was one of the drivers for moving toward a performance-based infrastructure project.
Frank, of those parties, who are members of Long Beach Judicial Partners, LLC?
The only member of Long Beach Judicial Partners is Meridiam. In rough numbers, this is about a $500 million deal. Meridiam was required to contribute 10%, or just under $50 million. The balance was $450 million in debt. So as you'll see as we get into this, think about who's at risk for a successful project where you have the equity has $50 million and has no obligation. It's a non-recourse deal. They have no obligation to put any more money in this deal. So they know if this deal fails and ends up in bankruptcy, while they've lost $50 million, their losses are capped. And the way these funds like Meridiam work, this is not Meridiam money. They have a series of funds from various pension funds and whatnot, which they put money into the deal. So you have $450 million, in this case coming from 6 commercial banks. So when you sit down at the table and you talk about what's the most challenging agreement to negotiate, first there's really 2. There's the agreement between the AOC and the project sponsor as to exactly what the structure of the deal is. Then there is the agreement between the lenders and Long Beach Judicial Partners. And that's a challenging agreement, not so much for Long Beach Judicial Partners, because they know whatever risks are included in their agreement with the lenders, whatever risks are included in their agreement with the AOC, they will have zero of those risks. They will flow through 100% and waterfall down to the builder, the designer, or the facility contractor. This is a whole, for Clark, this was a whole another level of risk that we're builders, we're design builders. Now we are developers, designers, builders, and anything else that needs to be done from the time of closing until the time of delivery, at which point Johnson Controls picks up and they have to perform every obligation for the remainder of the lease term.
Our CEO calls it an unnatural act.
I did a talk last year with Meridian, with Joe Aiello, who runs a big portion of Meridian. And Joe was supposed to be, I was telling these guys a little bit earlier, about 300 people in the audience. Joe calls me a couple hours before the presentation, says, "I'm stuck in New York, I'm not coming." "All right, Joe, can you send me your notes?" He goes, "Well, we don't have any risk. Tell him that." So that was the presentation on behalf of Meridian, on behalf of the project company. Zero risk. I'm going to talk about that in a minute.
So as far as the development of these projects and why the AOC, why the agencies like them so much, in the case of this project, it was the first performance-based infrastructure project, social infrastructure. There have been road projects. I worked on the Dulles Greenway, which was the first road project back in the early 90s. Sam worked on one in Orange County in the early 90s. This was the first of going to jails, hospitals, courthouses, schools. And it hopefully will be a model. I know the state of Texas in Austin is looking at one. Travis County is looking at using the exact same model. They've actually hired the same consultant to advise them. It's design, build, finance, maintain for 35 years. The state has absolutely no risk. There were 11 consortiums that pursued it. There are a lot of teams around the world that will pursue this work. 5 teams were shortlisted, 3 selected for the final competition. The competition was 6 months with multiple meetings, and the way this project was run, different from projects we've seen in other states, is the AOC met separately with each of the finalists and negotiated, in effect, separate agreements, so that at the time of selection, they had an agreement that each group would sign, but they were not necessarily the same agreement. They were truly the bird on the wire. Yes?
Did they identify the criteria for the selection? I mean, is it
yes, the criteria.
Or economic based?
It was a combination of technical and financing package. And they evaluate the technical, then they move to the financing package.
Did you receive compensation for that
Sorry?
competition period? Did you receive? Did the parties who were the
There was a $500,000 stipend, and
We'll
the
get to
11 consortiums kind of walked down. Frank's going to hit on this in a minute. 11 went down to 8, went to 5, went to 3, and the losing 2 got a $500,000 stipend that we carried in our proposal, that
So
they
once
carried
again,
in their proposal as well.
the state was able to finance that over the term. They came. The selection was made in June of 2010. Once the selection was made, financial close took about 6 months, and we closed in December 20th of 2010. And there was the one group that's not represented here on this panel, but that was very much involved for the state, was the state legislature. The state legislature, Office of Budget, had to sign off on this deal before we could close. And actually, that was one of the final things. They signed off on a Wednesday, and they said the deal must be closed by the following Monday or the authorization was expired. So the team had already been working for a week in preparation for this, but for those 4 days, it was basically 24/7 for the lenders, for the Clark team, for the Meridian team. Very little sleep, lots of work, because it's amazing how many issues had yet to be negotiated.
I tell you, Tom, on that Wednesday, Richard and I Richard's our CEO, we got a phone call from the state government saying we had a non-union electrician on our team. And they said, if you want us to sign, it's a union job. So we sat down in about 5 minutes and decided it's a union job.
For those contractors in the audience, you can expect most of these jobs where there is public financing will end up being union jobs because the unions are well aware, they are tracking these projects, they know exactly where the pressure points are in Sacramento, and they're very good at what they do. Again, 3-year construction, 35-year operation, also includes money from a car park operation and some commercial and retail leasing in the building, but not a strong component of the project. The counterparties, which again, the biggest risk was state of California and appropriations, but you've got the state and LA County, which has a major part of this building, which is interesting from the state's perspective, and another reason why the AOC really wanted this project to go. This is the only courthouse they have where the probation department, the public defender's office, and the DA's office will all be located in the courthouse. So it really is a great project in terms of the efficiency of the justice system.
Yes, quick, I'll do this one real quick. The overview of the project itself, about 31 courtrooms, just under 550,000 square feet. We closed our deal December 20th, 2010 at 10:21 in the morning. Sometimes you just remember because it's a big victory day for us. It did make a big impression. We broke ground in June of 2011. We have about a 27-month construction schedule. So right now we're about 75% complete. We topped out steel earlier in May of this year. Next week, if you've seen a picture, or you can see a little bit of the rendering of the building, huge curtain wall building. We all declare victory October 4th on completing the curtain wall, which gets us dried in. And then we start commissioning. We have power in early November. We start commissioning probably mid-December of this year, the building. We turn it over in about 1 year from now. August 31, we turn the building over. It's been a pretty good ride for all of us. It was interesting. Through procurement, we got through SD drawings, and we stopped. And like you said, it dropped out of financing. We all got scared it was going to drop out of financing. And I'll tell you, as a team, as a group, we spent several millions of dollars chasing this over a period of 38 months. So we stopped. When we got awarded the job, 10 months to the day almost, we had 100% construction docs rolling. And obviously we started phasing the project ahead of time.
And so now this is design build. Everybody here, contractor, you can do design build. Be prepared for becoming Gerald Hines, Boston Properties, or any of your other favorite developers, because you will be dealing with every utility, every county and city agency, because now you have to pull every permit. And I'll tell you, for us, that was a little new and never done it in California before. So you have to be prepared to have your team in place to be able to do that, because you will get no time extension for delays because the government officials don't issue permits. This was a project risk assessment that the AOC did. They love the fact that construction risk was totally transferred to the team. They like the O&M risk was totally transferred to the team. In terms of interfacing, there was an agreement between the contractor and the facilities where they sat at the table with us and with the designer. So it gives us as a design builder comfort that when we deliver this project, it is acceptable to the manager of the building, and the manager of the building's comfortable when they get the building, it is up to the specs that is in their pro forma for managing this building to their budget. The change in law risk was one that we spent a lot of time on, and that did end up with some risk sharing. There is some risks that the project sponsor, which means the design builder, has to take because of changes in law, but we think they're manageable from our perspective, and there are certainly others the AOC recognized that they had to take. force majeure risk, there's a combination of insurance and risk sharing. And of course, in California, the big one is, what do you do with earthquake insurance? Certainly, the agency can say, just like to any private developer who does an office building, you have to take all the earthquake risk. If they do, there is a cost associated with that, and that was discussed during the negotiations. And there's, I believe, 7105, whatever the statute is in California, where most agencies, they take the earthquake risk over a certain amount of, I think it's up to 5% that the contractor has to provide. When the AOC looked at the numbers, they quickly came to the conclusion that there's no reason why that 7105 concept shouldn't apply to this particular project as well. Now, this is the most interesting part for those of you who have done perhaps design build or done development deals, which is typically done under a lease arrangement. The deal we did at UCSF for a new neuroscience center was a traditional real estate lease, hell or high water lease. Those lease payments are paid whether the heat works or the heat doesn't work. In this case, the availability model, not so much. And as a matter of fact, one reason why we had all European and Canadian banks where it was very difficult for the US banks to get their arms around the fact that if parts of this building didn't work, all of a sudden the rent payments, the availability payments, were reduced to the point where if the security for the building didn't work, which meant court could not be held one day because the prisoners couldn't be brought in, visitors couldn't be screened, there's a $250,000 a day which was deducted from the availability payments. And since it's a non-recourse project, at some point, if something really bad happened, the project goes into bankruptcy, and that's not good for the lenders. So the good news is Europe and Canada have been doing this for a long time. Although one thing we heard throughout the process, but in Europe and Canada, they don't have nearly as many lawyers, and they certainly don't have as many lawsuits. So people were concerned, but everybody got comfortable, and we moved forward. Now, another fascinating part was the value for money analysis. When this was all done, traditional procurement on the left, alternative financing and procurement on the right. The area of most interest that we've talked a little bit about is this little blue area in here, which is risk retained, and how do you value the avoided cost of transferring all of this blue over here to the procurement team where there's only a little bit of risk retained by the AOC versus a lot of risk retained. At the end of the day, and this becomes, what are the assumptions? Some might say it almost became political between various factions in Sacramento. And Comey, I'm sure that wasn't the case when you went through it. But it's very real, because when you talk to the AOC now, they feel they have a very good deal with the risk being transferred, the availability payment model, and knowing 40 years from now they're going to get a courthouse that has been maintained as well as any Class A office building in Los Angeles.
Before you switch, Frank, I think the next one's me.
Yeah.
So,
now we go to the sort of part of the slide presentation that really has a connection to our current location.
how many contractors out here? A good many. I made it in something we can all understand. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly from a contractor's point of view about these P3s. P3 with availability payment, what we did at Long Beach. So I'm going to be very candid with you as we walk through some of these. It's a lot of lessons we learned. And that light blue bar plays a huge role in the ugly. And I'm going to tell you how this all works. And this is from my point of view, from our point of view. And I think you're going to, if you'd quiz Sam, I think he'd tell you the same thing. Mark, the same thing. I think this is what you're going to end up seeing a lot as these P3 comes out. If you look at the good, I mean, this is cigar smoking, whiskey sipping good. It is. There's a demand for a new way to fund projects, a new way to take risk, a new way to build projects. And we are in the infancy of that happening in the United States. You're going to hear Mark talk about healthcare and how it's going to get started. And I'm telling you, it is going to get started in the United States. We're having talks about doing P3 in healthcare in the United States right now. It was interesting as we put together Long Beach. One of the things we bumped into quite a bit, mainly through Johnson Controls, Meridian, it was as goes Long Beach, so goes the rest of the United States in our contract negotiations, in the deals that were made. So it took us a lot of time to work through the deals and the contracts. You saw the picture of the one that Comey didn't like, and Sam, you showed, of the 12 documents that we signed. We signed 72 documents made up our contract. It stretched from me back to the cameras on a big conference table on December 20th.
Well, there's one good thing out of projects like this, so you will accumulate tens of thousands of frequent flyer miles.
As you get into the P3, you look at the light blue, the risk that comes over to your half the table, the risk equals the reward you get on these projects also. That's a good thing, because you can't take that, you can't get the same reward at a 1%, 2% in this market right now on construction, taking that kind of risk. One of the things we have found is there is a tremendous amount of oversight on our project. The AOC, the project company in Clark, we got an independent building inspector that he's the final say on whether we meet substantial completion. He's the final guy making the call. The 6 Financial Consortium Group, they have an inspector. Arab, Meridian has an inspection. AOC has an inspector. We have our own internal inspection in quality control. So it's 5 people doing quality control, 5 people doing all the inspections along the way, from contract document approval to what we're putting out in the field. And I'll tell you, that's one of those things that is a double-edged sword. And I will bet we'll hear about it in healthcare in a moment. But we have it where it's all kind of pumping together. This is a heartbeat. We're going together. We're hitting on it. It's not been an issue. The thought is that our punch list will be low. We'll have very little room for error at the end of the job. I can tell you, when it gets into healthcare and you incorporate OSHPD into these inspections, your heart pump is going to be a heart race on some of these projects because it is different, and you're incorporating people that are not used to doing this. And again, Sam touched on this, the competition on these P3s. You're getting up into thin air of the people that can go and do, the contractors that can go and perform a P3 and take this type of risk. This is the bad. You know, this is the, it's not so good. These are things you need to think about. You start looking at a lot of new teams, a lot of unconventional teams. You become a developer. You're working with, I mean, we have a, I think we call it a coordination agreement with Johnson Controls. And I'll tell you, for anybody that has worked with Johnson Controls, I can remember 3 years ago when we were sitting around the table, Meridian came to the table and said, we want to bring Johnson Controls in to be our facilities management partner. And as a company, we looked at each other and go, you mean the low voltage guy that's hard to manage? And
remember, this is being videotaped.
they have turned out to be one of the best partners in the whole consortium. And we're very open with Johnson. Our company has embraced them. We've had a lot of very good meetings with Johnson, but it's a part of this big corporation we did not know existed. And they have just skyrocketed as we went through this. And matter of fact, they were a big part of the scoring process for the AOC as well. It's a new concept for state agencies. A lot of public agencies have not done it. And what's interesting, even when they have done it, the people haven't done it. So you can have an agency, and Clifford Ham, you got to have a champion. Clifford Ham was the state's champion, just pushing, tucking in all the loose threads, tucking in this, tidying up that, dotting that I, crossing that T. We had a guy in Meridian, Stuart Marks, that many of us know. He was that guy. He was the champion. You get outside of those people, and it's a new process. And it gets to be like turning an ocean liner in a pond. It's very slow. We went through a lot of this when you start doing design build also. You got to get people up to speed with what you're doing and how it's happening.
So you would say one of the key things when you're going into a project like this from the private sector side is identify who your champions are on the public side and on the finance side.
I would think that.
I'd say for sure the project is only going to go ahead if there are champions there to support it. That may be the governor, but it means a lot of other people as well. And there's a lot of projects we've punted on because we just didn't think they had the champions there. We didn't think they had the support they needed to get across the finish line.
And I guess one of the last, it gets to be the bad. And this is bad just before it flows into ugly. And matter of fact, it starts flowing into ugly. It's the waterfall of the risk. I told you that short little story about Meridian telling me we take no risk, pass it on. Well, it ain't a secret anymore. And I'll tell you one thing that we have learned, and I tell AECOM was smart enough to do this, and we tell our architects, is you have to have a seat at the table. And the seat at the table is negotiating the prime agreement between the state and the project company, between the lenders and the project company, because if you don't have a seat at the table, you're going to be handed what you're going to get. So we've sat, tens of thousands of air miles. We sat through every single one. AECOM had input to them. They did not necessarily sit there, but they had input into all of it. Because what will happen is and this is on December 20th, when we finalized and closed this project, we did not have an agreement with AECOM. We closed at 10:21. At 4 o'clock in the morning, we were driving from Orange County up to LA, about 50 miles, pouring down rain. We were on the phone with France and New York with AECOM because we didn't have a deal, because they didn't sit at the table quite enough. So we knew what the risk was coming to us. We knew what the risk had to go to them. They didn't want the risk coming to them. So we got in a spot where we were going to be middled, and, well, we weren't going to be middled. So we ended up closing the deal with AECOM about 3 hours before we closed on the stock market with the rest of the group. Not the preferred method, but it worked. You had a comment, Frank?
No, it was, certainly we tried to have as close cooperation, and quite frankly, both sides agreed we should have even more. There are certain key issues you just have to nail down actually at the teaming agreement. I know working with the Keywood organization, we try and do that right out of the box.
And AECOM was a phenomenal partner. We got down to where we had one issue that we just couldn't get around, and they were at one point, we were at the other, and it went like that until about 4 o'clock in the morning. But it ended up very well. And I tell you, they have done, and I know you all do work with them around the country, they have done a stellar job in this job.
Because I'll tell you one thing that sells these deals, now maybe not on the road side, but on building like this, it's the design. We got to see, there were 3 finalists. When we were negotiating in San Francisco with the AOC, we were in an area where they had all 3 models. And we now understood, a comment that we had picked up earlier, was that your team's design was one that just really wowed everybody to the point of how can we find a way to do a deal with this team.
Right.
Exactly. So picking your design partner is critical.
Then you get into the ugly. And this is a really not so good. Sam touched on it a minute ago. The financing requirements, and some of those, not only the money portion, but it's the finance group that won't let the project company, won't let Meridian take any risk. They can't afford to let him take risks. So they want to make sure that that risk for the whole process just comes down, comes down, comes down. And it does. Very heavy security package, you know, upwards 10% security upfront day one. Mark, you know, you were on our project. One of the things we had to do on Long Beach is subcontractors had to saddle up 13.5% retention. And I tell you what, in this market, you go talk to a bunch of subs about 13.5% retention, that is a tough conversation. I'm just here to tell you, it is a tough, tough conversation. That's part of this. Everybody's going to help get the job done.
Is part of the security package a letter of credit in your
Yeah, the lenders are not apt. Well, a lot of states require performance and payment bonds. We're used to providing performance and payment bonds in the construction industry. Lenders don't care about performance and payment bonds. They don't think sureties will pay timely. They want liquid security. So that means on day one, there'll be a letter of credit posted throughout probably the entire term of the construction and into the warranty.
Well, that's exactly right. I can remember the lenders are saying, well, we can give a payment performance. Well, that's kind of nice, Jim, but we don't care about that.
So what? Yeah.
We want the cash. It's a very, very high dollar investment chase. We from the day we started, and we started, AECOM and I decided to go after this job, and we started building around that concept until we pulled in Meridian, all the consultants, a handful of subcontractors. 38 months, and that's a long time. There's a long gestation period when you chase one of these. So it is not a, you're gonna go have a rip 'em and read 'em on Tuesday, and on Wednesday you're breaking ground. This is, you get the idea now, either you start the idea with an agency, or there's already an idea started and you grab onto it. It can take quite a bit of time. I think the Presidio went a little bit quicker than that.
Not much. But
No,
yeah.
well, not much.
Well, and it's one of those where you see the CFO in the hallway and you tend to duck around the other way.
One of the last things that we found was a risk that was an underlying risk that not everybody would see right away, but change orders on the project. If the state came in, you know, I'm just going to pick, they have not done, we've had very, very few changes on our job. If the state would come in and add, call it $10 million worth of change orders, they don't write a check for $10 million. That $10 million gets trickled along 35 years. I can't trickle along $10 million for 35 years.
Any subs out here willing to wait for 10 years to take their change order payments?
So that was one of the things in our negotiations is Meridian set aside a hunk of money for the eventuality of if any changes came up. So they had a pool that they could pay the contractor immediately for change orders because we couldn't get strapped to a potential of, you know, I say 10 million. I can tell you some of our competition has gotten into real trouble on this where it's been 40 to 50 million paid over 50 years. And that is no bueno when it talks about paying subcontractors and getting paid.
Let me throw out a question to you and Sam then. So when we're talking about trade subcontractors, you mentioned on your job they took 13% retention because they had to. What about, we've talked about availability payments, and a good chunk of your money isn't paid until the facility's completed. Do you pass any of that other hardship on down to the subs besides the 13%? They just get paid in regular milestone?
We have not.
Yeah, because this deal, and I think the road is probably the same. The deals are financed, so you're submitting your monthly requisitions for payment. You're paid in full. Other than the retention, everybody's getting paid on time.
Percentage completion type
Pardon?
payment? Percentage completion
Yes.
type payments?
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Not milestones? Okay.
But bear in mind, there's only so much money available to pay for the project. So you've cut the deal going in. This, just say, you know, the project's $500 million, so you get $500 million in financing. If something happens and all of a sudden it's $575 million, somebody's got to come up with that $75 million bucks. The lenders, the developers, they don't have it. They don't have any mechanism for it. I suppose over time they can make it work. But that's a big issue with the P3 project because it's all in the four corners of the deal. And if you don't have it all financed, then there's an issue.
And so that is a risk that ends up on the back of the design builder.
So that's a little bit of kind of the ugly, the bad, and the good. I'll tell you, if you understand the risk, and we got indoctrinated by fire, I showed up at one of the meetings, Frank had a black eye about this big. I thought he was in a fight with somebody.
Stuart Marks and I had it.
Apparently he walked into a wall. But if you understand the risk, and if you can identify what it is, control that risk, these are very doable. And you can make money at them, you can make good friends at them, and I'm telling you, this is the way I think the United States is going to have to go, is they have to find a different way to procure jobs, because our public agencies are just not, they're not able to do that. And if you look at some of the courts in this state, California, I mean, their court list went from here to here to here. I think you can count them on one hand now, what they're doing. I think that wraps us up, Frank.
Yeah, just
That's a little bit
the
of what
benefits.
we've been talking about.
We've talked about it. They love the fact that the government is now provided with this leverage over the private sector and the transfer of the integration risk. It's all out of their hands. They like the fact that now the focus is not on the lowest construction cost, but it's on the cost of the building over the 40-year life cycle. They like the culture of maintenance, because maintenance from public buildings is often a problem. Here, there is so much time spent and focus on making sure the building is delivered at the end of the lease term in essentially the same condition in which it was completed. And finally, it just gives the government another tool as they decide design, bid, build, construction manager at risk, construction manager as agent, or now performance-based.
Great. So we're going to continue. Why don't we take 5 seconds, not to go outside, but just to stand up if you want to, stretch your legs, and then Mark Kempton's going to talk about the New Karolinska Hospital project.
So I think along with Sam here, I'm one of the only ones, I think we're the only two representing concessionaires or developers.
I never know what I'm representing.
Yeah,
we're morphing into it, I guess, but you're right.
But Skanska ID has long been involved in concessions globally. We consider, we're headquartered out of Stockholm, Sweden, but we consider the United States one of our home markets. And actually the majority of Skanska's revenue comes from our operations here in the United States. So Skanska Infrastructure Development is the development part of Skanska, the development business unit. And as was mentioned, I represent their interests here in the Western United States and Canada. But I'm going to talk a little bit about New Karolinska Solna, which is located at a medical facility located in Solna, Sweden, which is a suburb just north of Stockholm at the University of Karolinska. And the facility itself is really the premier medical facility in Sweden and frankly in the Nordics. And I would say that with these improvements, it will be one of the most advanced medical facilities in the world. The County Council Assembly of Stockholm dictated that the New Karolinska Solna would be the hub of a regional and national medical care system, and that which is internationally competitive. Okay, so that was their goal, as well as assuming a central role in the development of the District of Stockholm as a center for specialized healthcare. So there were a lot of high hopes that the County Council Assembly had for Skanska, still has for New Karolinska Solna and for Skanska's output here. It's the world's largest healthcare P3. It is 320,000 square meters in gross total area. And to give you an understanding of about how big that is about 92% the floor area of the Vatican, and just about 70% of the published floor area of the Pentagon. So it is a large medical facility. It has approximately 8,000 rooms, 800 beds. In each room, it's an individual room. So one bed per service suite. 35 operating theaters. This is Sweden's first PPP building. So they've done several public-private partnership projects in the area of transportation, surface transportation work. This is their first public-private partnership building. And the first P3 university hospital targeting LEED Gold certification. So the model, this is very similar to what we've seen on the other slides. Swedish Hospital Partners is the special purpose vehicle. Skanska and Innisfree are the two development partners, each of them putting into or purchasing a 50% equity stake in Swedish Hospital Partners. Swedish Hospital Partners itself goes out and then puts the deals together with the lenders. Now you understand Swedish Hospital Partners is a special purpose vehicle, and I think we've talked about this and I want to reiterate it. That is a shield between the county council, assembly, and the lenders, the agency involved, the university, and so the financial risk that is so part and parcel to these projects is being held by the special purpose vehicle, and that is significant. As we've seen in those P3s globally that have encountered revenue risk problems to the point where the special purpose vehicle is forced into bankruptcy, that shield provides significant protection, or it should, assuming that the contracts are written appropriately, should provide the significant protection necessary to make it a benefit to the owner. Skanska Healthcare put together a cooperative deal, and Skanska Healthcare is actually a combination of Skanska building in Sweden, Skanska Sweden, and other elements of the Skanska business family, and Core Service Management, which is managing facilities. They put together a deal with Swedish Hospital Partners, Skanska Healthcare doing the construction, Core Service Management providing FM. And ultimately, this will provide New Karolinska Solna. So, I don't have as many slides as everyone else here, but I think if we had to define the primary benefits as far as the county assembly, one, the risk. We talked about that, and that I cannot state more unequivocally and more enough, I guess, that is the most important part of this delivery method, is the transfer of risk from an agency that is unwilling or does not desire to manage that risk to the private sector that can handle it much more effectively, much more efficiently. Predictable cost and predictable timeline. So for X number of dollars, you're going to get this facility on X date, and it's going to be in the same condition as is contractually, as is defined by the contractual obligations in 37 years when it's turned back over to you. And if at any time we do not uphold our end of the contract, we take the hit. This is, so it's not a loan, again, talking about financing. This is not a loan that ultimately is going to get paid back, or premiums that ultimately must be paid back by the owner if the special purpose vehicle is not meeting the contractual requirements. And so you can see, and this is not just a design risk, not just construction risk, but also operation and maintenance. This is an availability payment project, and that's the availability payment oftentimes is defined as a lease back. It's defined as in some cases, a privatization of the facility. That is not the case. These facilities, these assets are not owned by the special purpose vehicle. They are always owned by the public agency throughout the length of the concession. The public agency simply concedes responsibility to the concessionaire for, in most cases, operation and maintenance once the facility is completed. And there are certain tax benefits here in the United States that can be taken because of that. There are certain ownership type tax benefits that can be taken by the concessionaire. But beyond that, this is not our asset. As such, you know, at any time, if the contract falls apart, if there's one side does not hold up their end of the bargain, held in abeyance for whatever reason, you know, the asset doesn't revert back to the control of the special purpose vehicle. Let's say Caltrans upsets Meridiam on, you know, the Presidio Parkway. Meridiam can't close the road. Say, all right, it's ours now. Or, you know what, we're going to put in a toll system where we're going to charge $50 to you know, for the southern approach to the Golden Gate Bridge. That doesn't happen. Caltrans maintains that level of control. The owner maintains that level of control. So you can imagine the benefits that this can provide to the owner, to the public ultimately, especially when you take into account the total life cycle cost and the risk, or sorry, the value for money analyses that you've seen earlier. Now, let me talk a little bit about this. I don't really have another slide, but I'd like to discuss, you know, the difference between Europe and the United States. This is not unknown in Europe. This public-private partnerships have been done for decades in Europe. They've been done in the UK, they've been done in Canada. Our northern neighbors are very experienced. They've been done in Australia very successfully, and there are lots of reasons for this, not the least of which is the fact that the public itself, interestingly enough, has a tendency to understand better a relationship. You know, we consider the United States the capitalist, you know, the vaunted capitalist, what's the word I'm looking for, haven here. I mean, but the fact is you look at Europe and you find a population that is much more comfortable with the concept of private enterprise being involved in these projects, especially when you present the value for money analyses. They've been introduced to these for years. They understand them better just because they have seen them for so long. The banks are very familiar. You'll look at many of these deals that we're doing in the United States today. American banks are still not nearly as involved. European banks primarily are providing the financing because this is something they're very comfortable with, that they understand. And so I think it really is truly a matter of time, and it's also a matter of education here in the United States before we see these deals ramp up more and more. Europe, like any other location, you know, goes through cycles. The UK right now is beginning to revert back to questioning the value. They call it something different. They don't call it P3. What will likely happen is there'll be questions about the value of letting private enterprise involved and stay involved in public projects. And what they'll do is they'll simply change the name of it yet again, and it will come back out in the next with the next government and be as successful as it has been. In addition, you see the public understands also the financial mechanisms of supporting the facilities that they enjoy. And unfortunately, many Americans are blissfully unaware of how their taxes do or do not pay for infrastructure. For example, transportation in the United States, everyone believes to this day, or I shouldn't say everyone, but the vast majority of Americans believe that their gas tax money goes to pay for the roads. And it covers the roads, and I've already paid my taxes, so why should I pay another dime? Why can't they take the money that we already have and build new infrastructure and maintain the existing infrastructure? Europe does not have that same attitude. First of all, that's an incorrect attitude. The gas tax has not kept up, and frankly, surface transportation is heavily subsidized, almost to the degree that transit is in this country. This concept is much more understood in Europe, and so that's I think another reason why you see the players involved all being more comfortable with the idea of allowing private infrastructure, because they know that even with the significant tax burden that we see in many of these European countries, they recognize that that does not fully allot for their infrastructure, and they also recognize the value of the increased effectiveness and efficiency of the delivery method itself. These are all things that we have yet to fully educate our public. We have yet to fully educate our government officials about. If you talk about design build and how much greater the efficiency is having the designers and the builders in the same room from the beginning of the project, just imagine how much more efficiency you can get by having the designers, the builders, the financiers, the operators, and the folks doing maintenance. This is literally designing and constructing for operation. So that creates more efficiencies, shorter time frames, often cheaper cheaper costs that greatly offset the premiums that come with a public-private partnership, that risk transfer.
I think that's part of the mission of education that's going to occur over years. That has to occur over years to educate everybody.
And Europe was, I talked a little bit about sort of philosophical, cultural differences between Americans and Europeans that I think was beneficial to the Europeans getting into this method of delivery. But Europe had its fits and starts too. It took time for this to happen. And again, the UK right now is actually beginning the pendulum is swinging back a bit. But you want to look at a real good location outside the United States, Canada. Canada really understands this, how this works. Infrastructure Ontario, Partnerships BC, these are quasi-governmental agencies, quasi-provincial agencies that provide the provinces with guidance, with assistance towards defining the right projects, finding the right projects for P3, private investment, and then nursemating these projects through to completion. And so I would argue that that is something, and we can talk about this as we move forward, that is something we could certainly use in this country. Some sort of equivalent, agency there, or Little Hoover Commission, or who knows what we would call it.
Because a key ingredient of the Canadian model is a form set of documents. Therefore, the cost to negotiate these deals is greatly reduced from what we see in the United States.
That's right, and they have a value. I'm sorry, Kumai. They have a value for money analysis that is well established, well understood, and generally shared with little variation between the provinces. And so that that provides them with a common frame of reference by which to judge the value of these projects. In addition, one more thing, they are, unlike here in the United States, the provinces are, and the federal government are equity partners as well. So they take an equity share, which is a little bit different than the way we do it here. But that's because they see the benefits not only of risk transfer, but also having ownership of the special purpose vehicles and the long-term gains that can be had in these deals. Anyway, I'll open it up.
I just wanted to add that I think one of the other reasons why I think you tend to see more P3s outside of the U.S. is the U.S. has one advantage in the financing area that the rest of the world doesn't have, which is tax-exempt bond financing. We're so used to that, it's really easy access money to most public jurisdictions at a very, very low cost. And most other countries don't have that. The problem with that is it doesn't lead to the life cycle delivery model that we've been talking about.
Right, and it's not apples and apples, it's apples and oranges. Because again, when you're getting that low-cost financing, you are obtaining that financing.
That's right.
The agency is taking on the associated financing risk.
Yeah, and then just to at least to be a little bit hopeful, in the current MAP 21, the federal authorization bill requires the U.S. DOT to come up with standard documents. So we're on our way to some uniform language and set of documents in the United States. I don't think it's going to be mandated, but at least they'll work towards developing some best practices.
Right, but we are here, and Canada was in the same boat. We are dealing with essentially 50 different countries as we do this. You know, I think it's a little easier when you have only 5. I think only 5 provinces in Canada really pursued public-private partnerships because there's frankly not much in the Northwest Territories or Nunavut that warrants that, although they actually are doing a project up in Nunavut. But the point I'm trying to make is, you know, the fact that the very nature of our country, the way we have constructed our government, and the interesting relationship between the federal government and the state governments makes this much more complicated for us as well here in the United States. You know, it is a state-by-state battle, and states like Colorado are very forward-thinking. They've put together a group called the High Performance Transportation Enterprise, whose sole purpose, it is a subset of CDOT. Their sole purpose is to identify and provide program management and again, nursemaid projects through to completion for the state of Colorado. And the champions are at the very highest levels of government. You know, you've got Governor Hickenlooper, you've got strong support in the legislature for these projects. So Colorado is a very nice place to be doing business, and I strongly suspect that we'll see some big projects coming out of Colorado in the not too distant future. Now turn to California, and you know, this has absolutely nothing to do with COME or Caltrans per se. Maybe some of Caltrans employees, and that is the PEG. We can talk about that a little bit later. But the point is you know, whereas Caltrans has really made, you know, valiant efforts to promote and push public-private partnership as a delivery method, they have run up against an incredible amount of pushback primarily from the legislature. The SBX4, which was the legislation which changed the Streets and Highways Code, enabling these deals for surface transportation in California, was really done as a deal to, you know, the Republicans demanded it in order to sign something else for the Democrats. It was sort of, you know, okay, we don't like this, but we'll sign it. I can't remember exactly what the quid pro quo was there. But
I just want to say I was not there, so I don't,
I don't
know anything about that.
No, but the point I'm trying to make is, you know, you're looking at a legislature that, you know, has signed legislation it doesn't particularly like, and that, quite frankly, given their druthers, they'd like to see this legislation expire at the end of 2016 as it's set to, basically turning back the clock. And I think that would be an absolute disaster, and I'll let others comment about this, but, you know, the state of California, again, we talk about financing. Sure, we need financing for things because we don't have the money. This delivery method provides a mechanism to get financing that we might not otherwise obtain, but also, really more importantly, to get financing that we are shielded from to some degree. And offset the risk associated with that financing, offset the risk associated with design and construction, offset the risk associated with operation and maintenance, all to an entity that chooses to take it on for admittedly a premium, but is also much more likely to be able to handle that risk. And in the end, we see some of these projects are huge wins. One, Autopista Central we did in Chile, was a situation where I think in business I've never seen everybody involved was happy. The owner was happy, Santiago. The concessionaires were happy. We divested our share after 3 years, once the asset was up and running, to the province of Alberta, their provincial retirement entity, and they have been extremely happy with the returns they're seeing. That is a market risk project, a toll project, so they're getting revenue back, and it's exceeding all expectations. So, you know, these deals can really provide a great deal of benefit to the private sector as well as the public sector, and it enables, you know, as contractors, it enables jobs that otherwise you're not going to see. That's right. You know, I mean, when it comes down to it, you want work. We all want work, and being able to provide this delivery method, you know, enables these jobs to happen. And so I don't know what else I can say about it except that, you know, go P3.
I think we ought to hone this presentation. 5 of us take it on the road, Mark.
Yeah.
Quick, just to conclude, a couple of rapid fire questions. The question is, and this is for the whole panel, following types of infrastructure projects in California over the next 10 years, which areas do you think, which types do you think are ripe for P3? Healthcare.
Well, certainly healthcare is a known success story in Europe, and the model logically should work well here. And with healthcare, you're looking at the potential for not only public-private partnerships, but also private-private partnerships, entities. Probably not Kaiser, because Kaiser actually has learned to do operation and maintenance, facility management fairly well. But some of these other healthcare agencies, they're in the process of providing, or in the business, sorry, of providing healthcare, not managing huge facilities or properties. And so this provides them an opportunity to be able to, again, offset risk, offset some of the responsibility to another private enterprise that does this quite well. But yes, at the county level, you know, I think you're going to see many more counties looking at this. We've heard from Santa Clara County, we've heard from Los Angeles County about, you know, what are these P3s and what can they do for us, and so I think there's certainly you'll see more healthcare.
I'm not sure you won't see it in another state first.
Yeah.
When you start talking about California, there's a whole different agency in Oshkosh.
Well, yeah, I was going to say there's an asterisk that you've raised, which
Sure.
is Oshkosh.
And so I think with respect to what Mark is saying, and I happen to agree with you, we happen to agree with you, I think you might see it in another state.
Or if it's in California, I'm sorry, if it's in California, maybe that design risk transfer model needs to be changed a little bit for health, because you're not going to be able to, if you're the owner, you're just not going to be able to transfer all the control of the design onto the contractor without involvement, significant involvement
But
by
even in
Oshkosh.
the design build they're doing now,
Yeah.
they are transferring quite a bit of that risk already. But it certainly it weighs in as you look at the value for money.
All right, another area, over the next 10 years, water treatment facilities. P3?
Yeah, there's definitely, you know, I mean, we're looking at desalinization in Southern California. Certainly a potential there. Again, you know, there have been efforts to do P3 with water and wastewater management in the past. That has been attacked heavily because it's been deemed privatization. Again, you know, that's a matter of education. People have to understand that while we may operate and maintain the facility would still maintain, you know, would still be in the hands of the public. And so, yeah, I mean, there's one of the things that's most important in the Western United States is water, right? And you look at a good example, you look at the state of the levee system you know, in and around Sacramento, Stockton, San Joaquin area, the Delta. It is a disaster waiting to happen. And I believe Senator Feinstein has talked about the potential for using P3 as a model to start delivering there, because the state really just does not have the money. Now again, that's the argument. We don't have the money, let's do it P3. That's not the best way to look at it, but frankly, if that, you know, if it's not a pretty win, we'll still take it. You know, if people want to push the delivery method because they think it's a way to get cash, you know, but we need to be working at the same time to let them understand that there's more to it.
Alternative energy power projects, P3 in California?
Absolutely. I was at a conference earlier in the year that I thought was mostly transportation, and 75% of the presentations were on power. It was a P3 conference in San Francisco. In fact, there are a number of projects that are underway, huge projects underway in Mojave Desert, for example, that are P3s.
That are P3s now.
Yes.
I mean, that is occurring, Bill.
Frank and Jim, courthouses, P3 going forward in California?
I think people are going to wait and watch and see how Long Beach plays out. So I think it's 5 to 10 years before you'll see the next courthouse done in California, because they're all under the AOC's control. So they're really going to have to prove their case, I think, before they do the next one. I still think roads and bridges, I see transportation, the needs in California are tremendous. And there's now a model in place, CEQA being probably one of the biggest, the environmental impact in the CEQA process that can slow that down.
There are the regional transportation agencies right now in California that are looking very seriously at P3 projects, right?
Yep. Down NTA, down
Well,
south.
LA Metro.
LA Metro.
Yeah.
LA Metro.
LA Metro has a plan for $20 billion in P3 procurement over the next 5 to 8 years. So,
And they have a funding source, right?
and they have a funding source. you
They've
know.
got a set aside on some taxes that are going to pay for those projects, and that's the key, is making sure there's money coming from someplace.
It is. It's very nice to know. You know, I mean, the whole concept of America Fast Forward and the 3010 is to leverage, you know, measure our funds that are going to be coming in over the next 30 plus years. You know, leverage those future funds to deliver projects in the next 10 years. So my understanding is 3010 really was sort of the model upon which America Fast Forward was built.
Yes.
And they are doing a fantastic job of putting together a plan and of using alternative delivery methods like P3 to execute that plan. The problem is two things. One, they have yet to deliver. I mean, they've used some Measure R funds, no doubt, but really we're only just now on our first P3 down there, the I-5 bundle, for lack of a better word, the Highway Goods Movement Package.
And that's essentially because the other projects, like the 710 projects, are just beginning to snake through the environmental process.
Right, and also
should be
because
done soon.
as Doug Failing has said, this is an opportunity to get projects that are maybe not shovel ready, but past environmental, bring them together, market them as a P3 and get them delivered quickly and get the board of directors' feet wet so that they understand and so the public understands, how the model works. And I think, ultimately that's a good idea. But having a plan is good. It's executing that plan. So let's hope that they're able to do that. And the one thing that does concern me about the Highway Goods Movement Package is, if it does not succeed for whatever reason, that will poison the well for these other, potentially for the 710 North and South, for the High Desert Corridor, for the Sepulveda Pass, if that were going to happen. And that would be really disconcerting because, these are really good, solid P3 projects, whereas the Highway Goods Movement Package is sort of a, these could be delivered in different ways. They've sort of
absolutely, and I think one of the things to keep in mind is while LA Metro is the lead because of the fund source, these are state highway projects that we're right in the middle of. So I would argue that it might not be that bad in the long run that we get them done. I think we just have to be mindful that without the environmental approval on 710, which the South is coming through, and we hope to get that done, that's a huge procurement of about $6 to $4 billion worth of project. The gap closure is another $4 to $5 billion worth.
Oh, yeah.
So these are huge projects that you saw the list of contract documents. I would imagine when you're doing a $6 billion project, we're going to need a building for the contract documents ultimately. But my expectation is we will begin to see more highway projects in the next 18 to 24 months. It's a long time to wait for projects, given that we just got done with Presidio and people were expecting to see more projects. I think the bundle sort of holds the middle there, allows us to be doing something between now and when the 710 projects are ready to go.
I think we're looking at now financial close sometime in early 2014, as I understand it. But that is an issue because you've got regional agencies, you've got state agencies, so it's Comey's asset, you know, it's Doug Fahling's money. That's, you know, I'm way oversimplifying this, but you know, that means that there has to be a cooperation agreement put together, and then you've got the FHWA now involved as well. So you know this requires a lot of complex coordination. You know? But that's ultimately, as we do more and more of these, that's going to go faster and faster.
Well, gentlemen, on behalf of all of us here, we want to thank you for being on the cutting edge of this issue, and we want to thank you for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us here today. The panelists, I think, will all be downstairs with us in a few minutes for cocktails and dinner. So if you have any questions, given the time, let's have those questions down there. Thank you very much.